Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Narayana Namaskritya Naram Chaiva Narottam Devim Saraswatim Vyasam Tato Jayamudire Nashtaprayeshu Abhutreshu Nityam Bhagavata Simya Bhagavati Uttam Shloke Bhaktir Bhavati Naishtiki. So continuing with the discussion on Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 11, Chapter 3, Text 37 onwards. So Pipalayan Rishi is further speaking. Sattvam Rajastama iti trivridha ekam ado sutram mahan ham iti pravadanti jivam jnana kriyartha phalarupa tayor shakti brahmeva bhati sadasacchatayo param yat. Originally one, the absolute Brahman, comes to be known as threefold, manifesting itself as a three modes of material nature: goodness, passion, and ignorance. Brahman further expands its potency and thus the power to act and the power of consciousness become manifest, along with the false ego, which covers the identity of the conditioned living being. Thus, by the expansion of the multipotencies of the Absolute, the demigods, as an embodiment of knowledge, become manifest. Along with material senses, their objects, and the results of material activity, namely happiness and distress. In this way, the manifestation of the material world takes place as a subtle cause and as a material effect, visible in the appearance of gross material objects. Brahman, which is a source of all subtle and gross manifestations, is simultaneously transcendental to them, being absolute. So again, very philosophical, very technical points about the creation, how it comes into existence. In the previous verse, the sage Pipalayan described the absolute Brahman as being beyond the range of material sense perception and mental speculation. At the same time, it was stated, Atma Moolam Arthokatam Aha Yadarite Na Nisheda Siddhi. The negative injunctions of the Vedas indirectly indicate the existence of the absolute truth. This absolute truth can be approached by correct means. Now, in the present verse, it is clearly described that the absolute truth possesses innumerable potencies. Thus, by the expansion of the absolute truth, the gross and subtle features of the material world become manifest. As Krishna says in Bhagavad Gita, Aham Sarvasya Prabhava, everything comes from me. It just, in Bhagavatam, it is given in a little bit more detail how everything comes from him. As stated by Srila Sridhar Swami, the result is not different from its cause. Therefore, since the absolute is eternal existence, this material world, being the potency of the absolute, must also be accepted as real. Although the various manifestations of the material world are temporary and thus illusory. The material world should be understood to consist of the bewildering interactions of real elements. Material world is not false in the imaginary sense of the Buddhists and Mayavadis, who state that in fact the material world does not exist outside the mind of the observer. So this is how they explain this. Brahma Satya Jagan Mithya. So everything what we have is in the mind. It doesn't exist, but everything exists. It's temporary, but whatever we see, it's there. The material world, as a potency of the absolute, has real existence, but the living entity becomes bewildered by the temporary manifestation, foolishly taking them to be permanent. Thus, the material world functions as an illusory potency, causing the living entity to forget the spiritual world, wherein the life is eternal, full of bliss and knowledge. Because the material world thus bewilders the conditioned soul, it is called illusory. When a magician performs his tricks on stage, that which the audience apparently sees is an illusion. But the magician actually exists, and the hat and the rabbit and whatever paraphernalia he uses, they all exist. But the rabbit coming out of the hat is a trick, although it says here illusion, but it's a trick or an illusion. Similarly, when the living entity identifies himself as part and parcel of the material world, thinking I'm American, I'm Indian, I'm Russian, I'm black, I'm white, he is bewildered by the magic of the Lord's illusory potency. The conditioned soul must come to understand I am a pure spirit soul, part and parcel of Krishna. Now let me stop my useless activities and serve Krishna, since I am part of him. Then he is free from the illusion of Maya. If one artificially tries to escape the clutches of the illusory energy by declaring that there is no illusory potency and this world is false, he merely falls into another illusion created by Maya to keep him in ignorance. So that's why these Mayavadis, they are in complete ignorance. First, they don't believe or understand the position of the Supreme Lord, and secondly, they say this material energy is all illusion. It doesn't have its existence, and this is more ignorance. Krishna says in Bhagavad Gita, Devi hi esha gunamai mam maya. So unless one surrenders at the lotus feet of Mahesh or Krishna, the Lord of the illusory potency, there is no possibility of escaping from illusion. Childishly declaring that there is no illusory potency is useless, since Maya is Dhrutyaya or insurpassable for the tiny living entity. But Lord Krishna, the omnipotent personality of Godhead, can immediately call off the illusory potency. All we have to do is take shelter of his lotus feet. In this verse, the expansion of the material world from Brahman, the Absolute, is described. Since Brahman is one of the subordinate features of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So Brahman means Brahmjyoti. One who understands this material world to be Brahman is freed from the tendency to exploit the material energy through sense gratification and mental speculation, aimed at one's own satisfaction. So once we understand this material world comes from Brahmjyoti, comes from the absolute truth, we'll not try to exploit, but we'll still, because we forget all these things. The question may be raised, since Brahman is stated to be Ekam or one, how does it become manifest in the innumerable varieties of the material world? Therefore, this verse uses the word Uru Shakti. The Absolute contains multipotencies as stated in the Vedas. Parasya Shaktir Vivideva Shruvayati. The Absolute Truth is not Shakti or energy, but Shaktiman, the possessor of innumerable potencies. According to Srila Sridhar Swami, one should submissively hear these authorized descriptions of the Absolute Truth. So, as stated in the previous verse, the insignificant sparks of a fire have no power to illuminate the blazing fire, which is itself the source of all illumination. Similarly, the tiny living entity, who is like a spark of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, cannot eliminate the personality of Godhead by his insignificant intellectual power. One may argue that the sun expands its potency in the form of its rays, and it is through the illumination of those rays that we are able to see the sun. In the same way, we should be able to perceive the absolute truth by the expansion of its potency. But it is said that if the sun creates a cloud covering the sky, that despite the presence of sun rays, the sun cannot be seen. Therefore, ultimately, the power to see the sun depends not only on the sun rays, but on the presence of a clear sky. So this is how we can understand the absolute truth, that when skies are clear, all the Maya is gone, then we can understand. Again, it's a very long purport, so we'll just go towards the end. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur has pointed out that in the impersonal Brahman, there is neither transcendental activity nor the supreme Parmartha, or the benefit of human life, namely prema. Therefore, if one is prematurely dazzled by the expansion of the Lord's bodily effulgence, known as Brahman, and therefore does not actually come to know the Supreme Personality of Godhead, there is no possibility of actually understanding one's eternal identity as an eternal blissful expansion of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So one has to, but also it is said, if one knows Krishna, he knows all his expansions. So philosophically, we have to understand Krishna is the Supreme Bhagwan, and Brahm Jyoti and Paramatma are two different aspects of Bhagwan. But Supreme is Bhagwan. Text 38. Natma jajanna marishyati nathate atso nakshiyate savanvidha vyabhicharinam hi sarvatra shashvadan paya uplabdhi matram prano yathendriya balena vikalpitam sat. Brahman, the eternal soul, was never born and will never die, nor does it grow or decay. That spiritual soul is actually the knower of the youth, middle age, and death of the material body. Thus, the soul can be understood to be pure consciousness, existing everywhere at all times and never being destroyed. Just as the life here within the body, although one, becomes manifest as many in contact with the various material senses, the one soul appears to assume various material designations in contact with the material body. Again, very, very technical words. The Vedic aphorism, Sarvam Khalam Idam Brahma, everything is Brahman, has been explained in this chapter of Bhagavata. The Supreme Personality of Godhead is the original source of everything. By expanding his internal potency, he manifests the spiritual world. And by expanding his external potency, he manifests the material cosmos. The conditioned living entity is originally part and parcel of the superior internal potency of the Lord. But being in contact with illusion, he falls under the clutches of the external potency. So conditioned living entity, means us, is originally part and parcel of the superior internal potency. But being in contact with illusion, because we are so infinitesimal, we can come, or it is he falls under the clutches of the external potency. So that's why we are called Tatastha Shakti. Tatastha, just like a shore of the ocean. Sometimes the sand on the shore is underwater and sometimes it's under the air. So that sand particle is very, very minute. So it can be underwater, it can be on the shore, in the dry area. It depends where do we want to be. In any case, since everything is an expansion of the potency of the Supreme Brahman, everything is part and parcel of the Lord's spiritual potency. When a living entity thinks that the material world is not part and parcel of the Lord's potency, but is a separate existence, liable to be controlled and enjoyed by the tiny jiva soul, he is under viparyaya, or a wrong conception. So tiny jiva soul, we are under Maya, but we think I'm the controller, I'm the enjoyer, I'm the proprietor of everything. Thus, the living entity forgets that the Supreme Lord is the proprietor of everything being an expansion of the Lord. Srila Sridhar Swami has pointed out that although the Lord's external potency is subject to transformation, such as birth, growth, decay, and death, one should not foolishly conclude that the Lord's internal potency, the living entity, is also subject to these changes. Both the living entity and the material nature are ultimately Brahman, being expansions of the Supreme Brahman. But the Vedas clearly say, Parasya Shaktir Vividha. The Lord's potencies are Vividha, or multifarious. Thus, according to this verse, the soul is never born, nor does it die. And he certainly cannot grow or decay like a material body. And this exactly, all these things are explained by Krishna in the second chapter of Gita, in the very beginning. You cannot do anything to the soul. Cannot cut it to pieces, cannot dry it, cannot moist it, cannot burn it, cannot do anything. So it doesn't decay or grow. It just remains whatever it is. Although the visible material body passes through boyhood, adolescence, and old age, or although one may take birth as a demigod, human being, plant, or animal, the spirit soul never changes his eternal constitutional position. Rather, he falsely identifies with the external transformations of the material body and thus imposes upon himself a psychological condition called illusion. This miserable illusory experience of seeing oneself transformed and ultimately annihilated by the laws of nature can be nullified by transcendental knowledge of one's eternal status as a superior energy of the law. Even in Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says, just cut this bondage of ignorance with the sword of knowledge. So knowledge means the spiritual knowledge. And then one can really see who he is. The word sarvatra in this verse should not foolishly misinterpreted to mean that the individual jiva soul is all pervading. The soul is not born, nor does it die. Yet in our present conditioned state, we falsely identify with the birth and death of the body. Therefore, because an all-pervading soul would never fall into illusion, sarvatra cannot indicate that the individual soul is all-pervading. Illusion implies an incomplete understanding of reality, which would not be possible for an all-pervading entity. Therefore, the word sarvatra is understood to mean that the pure spiritual soul exists in all material conditions. So sarvatra means it exists in all material conditions, not just it's everywhere. Only Paramatma is everywhere, not Jivatma. In deep sleep, for example, consciousness may not overtly be manifested, yet the spirit soul is understood to be present within the body. Similarly, it is understood from Bhagavad Gita that the spirit soul may exist even within fire, water, or outer space, since the existence of the soul never depends upon material conditions, but is an eternal fact. The consciousness of the soul is more or less manifest according to the possibilities offered by a particular material situation. Just as electric light is manifest in a particular intensity and color according to available. So electricity is electrical 100 watt, 500 watt, 1000 watt, whatever color of it. But the electricity is the same. So similarly, soul is same. It just whatever consciousness and then whatever gross body one gets, then the soul acts according to that body. The objection may be raised that although the spirit soul is pure consciousness, it is our practical experience that consciousness is constantly transformed. If I'm thinking of a blue object such as the sky, then my previous thought of a yellow object such as flower is destroyed. Similarly, if I become aware that I'm hungry, then my consciousness of the blue sky is destroyed. In this way, consciousness is constantly being transformed. Srila Sridhar Swami has replied that consciousness itself is eternal, but in contact with the material senses, it may be manifest in various ways. The example of the life air is very appropriate. Prana or the life air is one, but in contact with the different senses, it is manifest as a power to see, power to hear, and so on. Similarly, consciousness, being spiritual, is ultimately one, but when in contact with the various senses, it may be perceived in terms of particular sensory functions. But the state of consciousness is an eternal fact that cannot be changed, although it may be temporarily covered by Maya. So sometimes it is that the consciousness gets impure, or sometimes it is that consciousness, the pure consciousness, gets covered over by Maya. So what its constitutional position is. When the consciousness that becomes pure, it gets covered over. From a statemental knowledge is not impersonal, but entails gradually perceiving the pure spiritual soul within the material body. Just as in Bhagavad Gita, Krishna repeatedly says, Aham or I. This Vedic aphorism uses the word Tvam or you to indicate that just as the absolute truth is the supreme personality of Godhead, the individual spark of Brahman, that is also an eternal personality. If according to Srila Jiva Goswami, it is to be understood, the individual spark or Jiva, living entity of Brahman is eternally conscious. Eternally conscious. It's not that sometimes we will not. Eternally. Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur has further pointed out that instead of wasting time trying to understand the truth in its impersonal aspect, which is merely the negation of temporary material variety, one should try to understand oneself to be an eternally conscious entity in the Jiva category. And then we can try to be understand to be that I am eternally conscious and eternally conscious servitor of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So Srila Madhvacharya has quoted this verse, the living entity known as Jiva is not different from me, for he is my expansion. Thus the living entity is eternal as I am and always exists within me. But you should not artificially think, now I have seen the soul. Rather, I, as the Supreme Personality of Godhead, will bestow this benediction upon you when you're actually qualified. So this distinction of soul and super soul is always there. But first we have to come to this point of understanding that I am a living entity. I'm a soul. I'm Jiva, not this body. So I guess I can stop here. There are more technical explanations for the next verse also. And also to make an announcement that tomorrow I have a house program to go to. And then Saturday is Radhashtami here. So again, 2 days, there won't be any class. So you all have a wonderful Radhashtami festival. I think in India it's on Sunday. So our next class will be on Monday for you all. So thank you all very much. See anybody has any questions or comments.
Thank you, Prabhuji. Happy Radha Ashtami.
Thank you,
Prabhuji, can we be part of that house program?
Radhashtami what?
I said, can we also be a part of that house program, which you were just mentioned?
I'll see if they can do some Zoom program or not.
Okay. If it's possible, online.
Sure, man.
Thank you, Prabhuji.
But it won't be the same time. It will be a little earlier.
Okay. I'll try to join if it's possible.
Okay. Sure, man. Thank you all. Thank you. You all have a safe and wonderful day.
Thank you. Hare Krishna. Jai Srila Prabhupada.